Hey everybody, today we're going to talk a little bit about basic exception handling. Um, this is a way of dealing with errors that may occur when your program is running. Up to now, we've been coding programs kind of hoping that our users, our program users, will enter data in the correct format. Um, Obviously, as you know, in the real world, that doesn't always happen. Program users can mess up, just like we as programmers can mess up, and they can enter in the wrong information when they're using a program. So exception handling in C# is done pretty easily. It's not too difficult to implement it. And the good news is that it's pretty automatic. Once you set it up in your program code, there really isn't much to it other than adding your regular code and kind of putting it inside a different kind of a code block. And the code block that you put it inside of basically checks the code, makes sure it's okay, and then everything runs normally if there's no error. If there is an error, the code that we're going to learn will handle it very gracefully and give you more options than you have now. Instead of your program just simply stopping because of an error, you'll have options now. You can sort of direct your program user to do something different. Flag the error, tell them, hey, you got an error. Do you want to do this? You want to do that? So it's a lot better than the way we've been working up to this point. So let's just look at what a basic exception is. An exception is an error, as I said before, and that occurs when your program is running, when it's actually executing. An exception is different from an error you might get when you're coding, a syntax error, which is what Visual Studio flags with those little squiggly red lines. So if you're missing a semicolon, or if you're missing a parenthesis or a curly brace, that's a syntax error. Maybe you misspelled a function, or you misspelled something. That's a syntax error, and Visual Studio will flag those errors before you even run the program. Okay, so you really can't run the program until you correct those syntax errors. When an exception occurs, it's the program, as I said, is already running, and we usually refer to this situation as the program crashed. Okay, blew up or whatever. There's a lot more colorful terms that I won't go into here, but my program crashed. That means it did run, but something happened during the time it was running to stop it. Now, the reasons that exceptions occur, there are quite a few different reasons. One of the most common reasons is when a program user enters the wrong kind of data. So you may need the user to enter a number, but they may enter a letter or a period or some alphanumeric. And the program gets that information and doesn't know what to do with it, can't parse it into a numeric, so it doesn't know what to do, so it just stops, simply stops. Some other reasons might include that if you're, let's say for an integer numeric, if you enter a number that's too big for an int data type, your program will crash. You'll get a message saying basically it's an exception, it can't handle it. Another reason that we're going to see as we go into our next units, the program may attempt to access memory that is being used by some other program or your operating system, some non-related system resource. Okay, that can cause an exception as well. So, as we said, we can deal with this by using exception handling. Okay, and again, that's a way to transfer control from the part of the program that's experiencing the error to another part of the program that can handle the error, gracefully deal with the error when it occurs. There are 4 keywords that exception handling in C# are built upon: the try, the catch, there's the finally, and then there's the throw keyword. Now, in our course, we're only going to look at try and catch. We're not going to look at finally and throw. I have those. I have all of the definitions up on Moodle. Okay, if we go over to Moodle for a second, this is where we are right now. It's just under the Project 2 part. I haven't made it blue yet, but all the exception information, exception and error handling is here, including code examples. There's also a table that explains all the exceptions and description of what those exceptions are. Basically, just gives you information about how to use the exception, the error handling. but I'm going to show you too. So let's look at the try block first. The try is a keyword, has its own set of curly braces, like if or while or any of the loops. Now try is not a loop, okay? It doesn't work like a loop. Basically try just sits there and you put your code inside of it. Now the code that goes inside of a try block is code that could possibly contain an error. In other words, it could contain an issue, maybe through program input or however whatever might cause an exception. This code you put inside the try block. Not all of the code in your program will go inside of a try block. Maybe you only want a little bit of the code to go inside the try block. You can have numerous try blocks in your code. Okay, there's no real limitation on how many you can do. A try block is also is followed by a catch block. Okay, so let's look at the try block first. In this example here, we have you'll see here it says try. You see your curly braces and the code in red. Right now I have a comment. It said code inside these curly braces will be checked for errors. If no error happens, the code is run normally. So you won't even know that it's there. It's just simply in the background checking to see if any errors occur. Now if an error occurs, what happens is the try will then throw the issue over to the catch block, which goes below the try block. So you need a try and a catch block. You can have one try block, but you can have multiple catch blocks. And a catch block defines the type of exception that might be encountered. Okay, in this example, let me go to the next slide. In this example, the catch that I have listed here is looking for inside of it's followed by a set of parentheses, and this parenthesis has to hold the exception you're looking for. There's different kinds of exceptions, and they have this kind of they're described exactly as they are. Okay, I'll show you the table in a few seconds. This one particular example I have right now, it says exception. That literally means any kind of error that happens. So that's a bona fide exception. It's real. It'll catch any general exception that happens. You may find that there's a variable following the code. This is the exception code. You may find a space, then a variable following it. This is optional. The variable just happened to be called EX in this example. Okay, and that is where the system stores its exception code. Okay, so if you have an error, you're always going to get an exception code provided by the .NET framework. That's the framework that runs C#. Okay, and there's a library of exception codes. So when you come up with a particular exception code, it's going to put that, if you have it here, again, this is optional. The exception code will be placed into this variable, and you could display it, in your catch code. Now this catch code normally is code that you put in here that's going to deal with the error. Sometimes folks just simply, they will define their own code, okay, because the system codes are notoriously difficult to understand. They're confusing and they can be a little bit hard to see it's hard to tell what the system's talking about a lot of times. They're kind of cryptic. So a lot of times programmers will opt to put in their own explanation using a console write statement or whatever is going to display it if an exception happens. So again, there's only one try, which is going to contain the code that you want to check for errors. And then following that will be the catch, and there could be more than one catch block. Okay, there could be several. I'll show you that too. Okay, so going to the next slide, before we go to the code examples, I'm going to show you just a little table here that's going to list just a few of the important exception classes. There's a lot of them, but these are the ones you're most likely to encounter, at least in our course. So if you recall, if you go back one slide, you'll see this exception. That's an actual error code. Okay, it's not in the table here, but what happened is that catches most general types of errors. Okay, like it's just generic, doesn't really describe anything. But you could be more specific. If you're looking, let's say they entered, you were expecting them to enter a number, but they entered a letter, that would actually cause a format exception error. That's when a value is not in the correct format. Okay, so you would actually be using format exception in place of exception. Okay, so you'll get an idea when I show you in a second. So let's just take a look at some examples. Here's an original code example. Okay, console write, please enter a whole number, int mynum, int parse console write line. The number you entered is, we're going to display that number. So let's take a look. I'm going to actually go to Visual Studio, and I'm going to show how that works. So I have the code right here. Enter a whole number. That a little bigger. Okay, so I'm going to ask the user to enter a number. A whole number is an integer. I have an integer variable called mynum set up here. Okay, it's going to get parsed. It's going to be converted. It's going to be read in by console read line, and then I'm going to simply display the numbers. So if I run this program, you're going to see this. It says please enter a whole number. I enter 5. It says the number you entered is 5. Pretty simple stuff. Okay, if I run it again and I put in something, let's say that the program isn't really expecting, maybe I'll just put in a T. Okay, now something happens that is a little different from what we've been seeing, or you may have seen this before. We have an exception. Notice it says exception unhandled. We didn't handle this using try or catch. This was just a regular program written out without any exception handling. And you'll see that the Visual Studio displays the exception, format exception. Okay, it's preceded by this thing called system, which is referring to the .NET framework. That's where this exception is stored. Okay, and it says input string was not in a correct format. So this is Visual Studio doing you a favor and saying, hey, there's a problem here. Okay, so we have to kind of close this in Visual Studio. Okay, I'll just stop the program. And that's an example of an exception. Okay, so let's do this. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint for a second. Okay, and let's go to the next line. Okay, now that same code example, shows you how to put it inside of a try and a catch block. Okay, so we have, here's our static void main, here's our try, and here's our catch. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's see what we could do here. Let me go back to the code. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to just look and see. Put this whole thing. I'm going to put the try right here. Okay, I'm not touching my regular code. I'm just going to take my try block, and I'm going to encapsulate the code that I want to test. So you see that I put that inside of curly braces. Here's my try keyword. I didn't make any changes to the code. Okay, now I'm getting an error because it does need a catch. So I'm going to type in the catch block just below the ending curly brace for the try. Okay, I'm going to give this, I need parentheses here, and then I also need some curly braces. The parentheses is going to hold the exception. Okay, so I am going to basically put in the code format exception. Okay, I'll also put in the X keyword. I'm sorry, the X variable. Okay, and what I'll do is I'm going to then do a console write line statement just because I want to tell my user what the error is. And I'll just show you 2 ways to do it. I'm going to put my own statement in to make it easier for the user. Okay, and then I'm going to follow it with another console write line statement. Okay, and I'm going to display the system error. And I want to actually show what the system error is, so I'm going to display the variable that I've called EX. You can call it actually what you want. Okay, so this way, if I run it, we'll see what it does.